I'll just start by asking, what stood out to you about this scripture today? I'm sure you've heard it before. What was standing out to you today?
The whole day for them to miss it.
At its finest. So contextually, right, at the time, it was obligatory for those that lived in the area to travel to Jerusalem for 3 major holidays, for Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. So the Passover is celebrating when the destroying angel passed over the houses in order to get them out of Egypt. The Pentecost is the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, and then Tabernacles is when they were sheltering in the wilderness after they had exited Egypt and were on their way to the Promised Land. So all 3 of those festivals are really about this movement of freedom that's so essential to the people of Israel. And Nazareth is about 5 days' journey to Jerusalem. And everybody, right, this is a pilgrimage festival, so all of these people would have been traveling, like flowing into Jerusalem. Jerusalem, like, quadrupled or quintupled in size during these major festivals. And so there would have been huge numbers of people traveling together, you know, kind of back town to town. Like, think about the bus that leaves and slowly gets emptier along the way. So they get to one of those way stations and, you know, there's hundreds of people traveling with them. And they're like, oh, which one's my kid, right? Yes, sure, but also, like, if you have these huge groups of people that have a lot of this shared culture and probably a lot of extended families that are together, you know how there's the adults table and the kids table and God knows. I mean, I had kids over for a birthday party and I was like, wow, some people really let their kids just go about strangers' homes. Terrifies me, think about how many guns are in America, but anyway, I digress. But good point. It's a strange thing for us in our culture today, but there's a different context. What else stood out to you today?
It did seem funny that it took them 3 days to think of looking in the temple for him. If maybe in his earlier childhood he'd not had as much of a presence or not seemed to have as much of a calling, because if I were Mary, I think that'd been the first place I would have looked.
Sure. Scholars say it's not super clear when the 3 days starts. Hey, welcome. It's not super clear when the 3 days starts, so it could be the 3 days after they get back, or it could be 3 days after they left, which would be a day's journey out, a day's journey back, and then a day searching for him. So depending on your interpretation, I tend towards the 3 days after they left, so they found him in that 3rd day because it took them a whole day to get back.
So what stood out for me was that Mary and Joseph didn't understand why he would be why he said he would be at his father's house.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, they had like the angel experience and all that. That kind of had given them a clue that something strange was going to happen.
Sure.
So, anyway.
And one of the things I think after reading the gospel a few times to prepare for this series is you see this language, Mary treasured this in her heart. And I mentioned that last week when we were looking at the Magnificat. I really think that Luke, in his aggregating these stories and interviewing people, I really think he talked to Mary or talked to somebody who was close to Mary and got a bunch of these nuggets from her life. And this must have been one of those nuggets where we lost him and he said to us, well, where'd you think I was going to be, Mom?
I have lost my kid once down in Alki, and like she wandered off in that panic of not knowing where your kid is huge. He's so scary. And I'm so thankful to the people who had their picnic down there, who kept her safe till I could find her. And I was wondering who was taking care of Jesus. Like, how was he staying? Somebody had to be taking care of him.
Sure. Yeah, and there's no details in the text, right? We know that he's in the temple, he's having this conversation with these adults, these teachers, he's in the circle with them. He's sitting, but everybody else is sitting. The scholar said don't worry too much about the particulars of this, just the place that he is. He's engaged with this conversation. And he's 12, right? So he's not an adult yet in this culture. Adult is when you hit 13. It's not uncommon for stories about people like Moses to be told about when they were 12, these non-canonical stories that are passed down through history. Same with Josephus and other folks at that time, because it would have been indicative that like this person who is a child is able to match wits, right? This story tells us something about who this person Jesus is.
I'm actually reminded of your son, who was in the audience, and he seemed like totally bored and distracted. And then he came back and he made a really prescient comment about your sermon.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking like, this seems very similar.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who can distill like an essence from something. Like it's probably about this.
Sure, sure. Well, they say children are always listening, especially when they look like they aren't.
But culturally, wasn't it weird he wasn't at all contrite or concerned about it, but he kind of like talked back to his parents, that he wasn't at all concerned about that they were worried about him?
Sure, and that's they make sure to go on to say, and then he was obedient to them thereafter, right? Because one of the commandments, right, honor your father and mother. And so there is this kind of clap back. And also you get it specifically because Mary says, your father and I were looking for you. And he's like, didn't you know I'd be in my father's house? And basically Joseph disappears from the text at this point. He shows up in the genealogy, and then he shows up again when Jesus goes to preach in Nazareth, and they're like, wait a minute, isn't this Joseph's son? And Joseph doesn't show up again in the text. And so this is kind of this like, almost this like, know your place dude that Jesus is doing, which for me is part of like the terror that Mary must be feeling, is not only this terror of like losing your kid, but then also seeing, and folks that are parents probably can chime in on this coming into their own and recognizing they have their own path, their own destiny, their own purposes, their own life separate from you. And it's like, oh shit, where's this going? And especially to be somewhere in the halls of power, right? These are peasants. These are folks that live out in the middle of nowhere. Like Nazareth is a backwater town. Does anything good come out of Nazareth? And here he is mucking it up with these people that are elite and powerful, and he's asking them questions, and they're amazed at his answers. And that's kind of a dangerous place to play, right? There's sharks in the water, and we'll find that out later throughout the gospel. I want to start by asking you this question. When did you stop learning? Never. How was school for you? From a scale of, oh yeah, to where were you? Give me a mixed bag for a lot of you. How many of you grew up in the banking model of education? You, lowly empty vessel, shall receive my grand and sufficient wisdom, which I will pour out unto you, and you shall become like me, educated. How many of you? Some of it. How many of you were in the, hey, I know you've got stuff, I've got stuff, let's figure out what we can create together, let's ask better questions, model of education? Some, mixed bag there. Education has changed significantly over time, and the theories of education have changed significantly. That the banking model was really like this primary model of education, and memorization was incredibly important for a long time in American education systems, right? You needed to memorize facts and figures. You needed to know your 7 times 7 table, right? All of this stuff you had to hold on to. Is all of that very relevant today? How many times has somebody asked you a question, or you've seen someone ask a question that you had a memorized answer to, and they immediately did what? Pulled out their phone, right? Let's just Google it. How many times has there been a piece of information that's just like, why do I need to remember that? I can look up. How many of you know the phone numbers to more than 5 people?
But if you'd asked 20 years ago, we would have.
Absolutely. And addresses? God, I don't remember an address to save my life anymore. Because you don't have to. Because we've got all these systems to figure it out, right? To keep this knowledge, retain it. And so then the question is, how has education changed if retaining information isn't the key? This transition for me when I went to graduate school. There was a big shift in my understanding about education that had never been taught to me explicitly, but it was taught to me explicitly in graduate school, which is you are here to learn how to learn. There is no reason for me to teach you facts, figures, and information just so you have them, because what good are they if you can't apply them? And more than that, the thing that my mom told me when I was a kid, the job you're going to have doesn't even exist yet. That's not really true. This job did exist. But I love that she framed it out that way, because she said, don't try to learn for a job, try to learn how to learn and figure out what you love, and that will lead you, right? This kind of learn how to learn.
Where did you go to graduate school?
I went to Western Washington University for my first master's, and then I went to Pacific School of Religion for my ministry master's.
What years?
I was at, I finished my undergrad in 2005, I finished my first master's in 2010, and then I finished my what do I have now? I have Master of Divinity in 2014. So, yeah. And it wasn't until graduate school that they made it clear that, like, we're not preparing you for a job. If you want to be a lecturer, you still have to go get a PhD anyway. We're preparing you to learn and to figure out what you're all about, and then figure out how to learn that. And in graduate school, right, it's all about like knowing how to use the resources of the library, learning about the internet resources for research, learning about how to aggregate that information, blah, blah, blah. Some of you may have had to learn some of this stuff, and some of you learned enough of it to know you didn't want to do it and turned the other way and did something else. But this whole movement of education, and I think current thinking about education now, is it's all about learning how to learn, right? And we give these basic tools and basic information because you're going to need to then use them to learn more stuff, right? And you hopefully are figuring out what's interesting to you. But knowledge without power, or knowledge is not power unless it's applied, and figuring out how to apply it is part of that process of learning. And so we've got in Luke, we've got this story of this kid, this precocious kid who's in this place, somewhat dangerous place, but also a place that's right at the center of the knowledge and learning about God in this particular community. And of course, if that's what he's hungry for, if that's what he's interested in, if that's the call that's on his heart even before his baptism, which we assume it is by this story, then of course he's going to go to this place where he can learn. Now you've got this complicated relationship. He's got some daddy issues, maybe. Sorry, that's a bad joke. But he's also this committed learner. I was listening to this TED Talk recently that said, when Google is trying to hire somebody to work for them, they have a list of 5 top qualifications they're looking for. Which number do you think expertise is? Like knowledge and information.
5.
It's 5. Yeah. Number 1 is ability to learn. Ability to learn new things. Because we can always get more information, but it's about how we combine and utilize that information that really matters. And I think that this story, and it ends with Jesus grew in wisdom and age and favor humans and God. I think this story is really focusing on Jesus as this learner, that he may have been born with a heart for God. He may have been born incarnate as God's only son. But there was still quite a bit he needed to learn about how to express that to people. Now, you might know some people really well, and you know exactly how to talk to them, how to frame something out so they'll hear it, right? You're in conflict with somebody, you know this is a person I can make a joke with, and this is a person I have to be deadly serious with, right? If you want to tell somebody how it is, you do that very differently for different people. But if you only know a few people, then you only know a few ways to tell it how it is. The more people that you know, the more gradients of that you have to figure out. Because everybody's different. Just look around this room and think about who are 2 people you got to tell how it is in this room and how much differently you have to tell it to them in order for them to hear it and receive it. And then add to that the level of relationship that you have with them, the level of trust. What have you been through together that has allowed you to say what you need to say in the way that you need to say it? How much do you know about them and their history that you can draw on to speak the word? See, I think Jesus, even as a child, is at the temple because he's seeking to learn, how am I going to share this message that I have? I have something in me that needs to come out, and I know I can't just say it one way. What I love about the gospel is you see this diversity of approaches across the way. He meets everybody where they are and communicates that with them in a way that they need. Now, sometimes we think that Jesus is really derogatory towards the Pharisees. I think he's just super direct. He knows that they're not trying to muck around. They're not really all that interested in all the pleasantries. They're there for doing it right. And if they're in a right-wrong paradigm, then he meets them in a right-wrong paradigm and challenges their paradigm. Sometimes we set him up in this antagonistic place, but I actually just think that's more the mode of communication. You think about how he meets the people that are suffering, the people that are at the margins, the people that are feeling excluded and left out, and he meets them completely differently. He doesn't meet them in challenge. He meets them in grace. He meets them in welcome, in hospitality. He sets a table, or actually often is like, hey, will you set the table so we can bring all these people in together, right? But even that ask is an act of honoring, right? Will you set the table is also like, hey, will you give this gift? Will you host? Will you be somebody important in this work that I'm trying to do, right? It's not a burden, it's a privilege, especially in this culture at this time. So he's constantly learning how to do this thing. How am I going to bring people along? How am I going to grow this space? And it's freaking his mom out, I think. I think she's freaking right out because she's seeing like, oh crap, if this is what he's learning now, what's he gonna do with this? Like, I just think that his whole childhood is like terrifying to Mary because she can see this potential growing in him and she knows that it's going to lead him far away from her. There's this lovely quote by Einstein as somebody was interviewing him about his work on quantum mechanics, and he said, it's not that I'm any smarter than anybody else. It's just that I've stayed with the problem longer. It's not that I'm smarter than anybody else. It's just that I've stayed with the problem longer. And who could stay longer with the problem of human disconnection and suffering than Jesus? That he is constantly there, staying with the problem of disconnection, isolation, loneliness, fear, shame, and staying with us unto the end, constantly learning how to speak that word to us. And Joanne, you mentioned earlier about an organization that had a leader that dies, and the organization falls apart. Well, that is the story of the ministry of Jesus Christ. That they had no idea what to do when this guy was gone. Because he didn't teach them how to lead a movement. He didn't teach them how to make radical reformation in the world, how to dismantle empire. He taught them how to love each other. And fortunately, they learned that message enough that they could receive the Spirit of God, which would inspire them to the unique manifestations of doing that. He didn't call them to build an institution. He didn't call them to build an alternative kingdom of flesh and bone and mortar and stone. He called them to build a space for habitation together. And then out of that relationship, out of that connection, the new thing they needed to learn would be obvious. The new path for them would come out of that relationship. More to the point of what we were talking about earlier in the discussion. How do we learn how to be in relationship first? And how that produces mission, how that produces ministry, how that produces call. Because it's only by connecting with each other will we see the need that's present, and then figure out together, if we see the need, how to meet that need. Church is a community of learners because it's a community. Any community is a group of learners because being in relationship with people is hard work. And we grow by staying. It's not that I'm smarter than anyone, it's that I stuck with a problem longer. We're going to launch a program in May where I'm going to invite folks to do some volunteering very simply over at Brookdale Admiral Heights. I've already got 2 people going with me on a weekly basis, Kathy and Leonette, and I'll have them talk about this later in the month. Well, next week's the end of the month. But talk about their experience, witness to it a little bit next week about what it's been like for them. But I'm hoping to grow a ministry very simple, very easy, that's just about connection. Because we have a lot to learn. How many of you still have parents that are alive? a very small number of us. But we're going to have to learn how to support them, and there's some big transitions that are going to happen in everyone's life. How do we show up for them? How do we have the conversation in a way that they can hear it? How do we connect to people's values? The easiest way to learn how to do that is by doing it. And so how are we as a church growing in our ability to learn the things that need to be known so that we can go out and witness to this work in the world? If Jesus truly was this lifelong learner, then we are called to be that way too. What is it that you are desperately looking for the world to learn? And how are you